Afternoon to you all.
Hey.
Good afternoon, Tom.
Good afternoon. Just double checking you can hear me. It's all good.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
Oh, Kaisi, you are muted.
Oh my God, and I was preaching. Hello, amazing Vue Js community. It's another amazing Saturday, and we are here to learn as much as we can about Vue Js. We've got a really amazing set of speakers today. We've got Cham and we've got Omotoye, and they are gonna give us some really amazing tips that are definitely gonna make us better Vue.js developers. Thank you guys for joining. Really excited to have you here, and please stick around because there is a ton of stuff to learn. So without wasting any time, I'm just gonna hop to talk and give the speaker and give the mic to Cham. He's going to be talking to us about the best practices in Vue.js. He's a senior lead engineer and he's been working a ton with front-end technologies. He's got a ton of experience in architecture design and things like that. So we want to really tap into his wealth of knowledge and the stupid mistakes that we make every day when writing Vue.js applications. He's going to give us the best practices, how to have stable code bases, how to make sure that we are building for the future, implementing the best architectures and things like that. So thank you so much, Cham, for joining us. And I'm just going to go ahead and let you take it from here.
That's great. I'm just trying to share my screen. It says the host is disabled screen sharing.
1 second. Linda, can you fix that?
Yeah, give me a moment.
Okay, awesome. So Cham, you can go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself while Linda gives you.
Okay, it's fixed.
Okay, that's great. Seems to work now. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. As I've been introduced, I am the lead engineer at Opinio, and I'll be taking you through some Vue.js development best practices. Just a bit about myself. I started working at Opinio from one of the early stages, and being in a startup has constantly shifted my role. What my role has been, I've been going from front end to back end to infrastructure. And when we started growing our team and people that came in with varying degrees of skill set, and we had to make sure that everyone was on board on what the best practices are when we're using Vue. So my role currently is overseeing these developers and reviewing their code and seeing if they are still following these best practices. Because it's good to put some of these processes in place, but if you're not following them, then it doesn't really make sense. So I'm always making sure that our developers are on top of it. So I would like to share some of that knowledge today. Before I get started, I'll give you a quick introduction to what Opinio is and how we're using Vue.js for our current products. So Opinio is primarily based on the Shopify ecosystem. And for those that are not aware of Shopify, it's an e-commerce platform that allows people to quickly set up their online stores. The other thing about Shopify is it allows shop owners to enhance their stores using various apps that developers can publish to Shopify. And Opinio is one of these applications. And the problem we're trying to solve is businesses that sell on Amazon and eBay, they sometimes have to end up paying around 40% of their revenue to those e-commerce giants. And when they really want to grow and when they really want to, cut in, make sure they have a bigger margin, they want to move away from those big stores into their own store. And Shopify allows them to do that. However, the issue with that is if they already have products that are being sold on Amazon, eBay, Alibaba, and they are losing a lot of these reviews that are left there, because it's not an easy process to migrate all those reviews over to your own Shopify store. So what we at Opinio are doing is building an application, or I have been, our application is basically allow them to install our Opinio application to either allow their customers to start reviewing their products that they have, or have the ability for them to import those reviews from those existing stores, so they never lose any of that context. And over the years, we managed to help customers convert over $25 million in sales as we have continued to grow, and we have grown a lot in the last year or so, with over 10,000 users and around 1.3 million views a month and around 10 million reviews imported. So we at Opinio are using Vue quite extensively, from our customer dashboards that allows the customers to manage their reviews, manage their stores, manage the plugin, import reviews from these sources that I mentioned. But also we develop the widgets that go on the actual store. And these widgets, as you can see, there's some examples there. These are all Vue-based components, from the stars, from the ability to upload images, videos, make reviews, and also being able to have set up your sort of carousels for the images and stuff. The thing with that is that we have some constraints on how these Vue applications perform. So with the customer dashboard, I think we have a lot more leeway in terms of what packages we can use and how big that bundle size can be, because bundle size is very critical when you're running an application on Vue, because at the end of the day, if you are putting some of your widgets onto a store that a customer might have, you cannot slow down that store, because whenever anyone visits that store and these components are being loaded, it needs to be fast. And Shopify actively checks these on their application, on all the applications that they're hosting. We need to hit certain lighthouse scores to make sure that the bundle size is within that limit, both for Shopify's sake and all the shop owner. So it's not easy, because we constantly need to monitor that and make sure that we are always up to date, and we're always having to cut down on the bundle size. So it's an active process for us. We also recently migrated our main marketing website from with Angular and hosted on Firebase, but we migrated that over to Nuxt. And what Nuxt allows us to do is all our developers were able to really fine-tune different components and improve our lighthouse scores on our marketing website, which meant that our Google ranking results went up and improved our SEO in general. And we saw metrics that show that there's more users were able to discover Opinio in our application at the same time. Many of our internal tools are also built on Vue. So our support dashboard that our customer support team uses Vue for anyone that has issues, anyone that needs support, and also our internal testing tools are also built using Vue. So I think it's safe to say that we are all in Vue shop. So hopefully what I'm about to show today will come from the experience that I've gained through that. So now on to the actual meat of the content. So when I say VueJS development best practice, these are things that I have seen from developers that we have brought on board, but also during hiring processes that I've been through, reviewing code and coding challenges at the same time. What you need to know is that some of these issues are not exclusive to Vue, but we all know that Vue is built on built on Node, and it relates to the development of Vue. But I think there is a bigger takeaway on this as well, and it's mainly how do you actually build your Vue application so that it can be maintained, and looking at how it would be best to release something that's built on Vue to a production environment. And all as with best practices, right? These points can be very opinionated. What works for us might not work for you. You might have your own ways of doing it. But also it does not mean that this is the only way to do things. What I'm covering today is stuff that is based on years of experience developing front-end software, and what eventually ended up working for us as a team. So the first point I want to make is version management of your node. a lot of people, use Node in different ways, and Node is sort of the groundwork that you need in order to build your application, the building tools and to compile all that code to be able to bundle it up. And not many people that I've seen are using NVM, but it might be, depending on who you are. But a lot of people seem to just install Node as it is from, either their Ubuntu repositories or just downloading Node from the website. What I would recommend is use a version manager, right? So one of the most popular version managers is called NVM. So what is a version manager? So you might have different versions of Node, and now we're on Node 14, which is the active LTS, but you might have legacy applications that you're still having to maintain that might be based on Node 10 and 12, and hopefully not Node 10 or anything less. But the issue with it is that if you're now working on new projects, you're having to use a different version of Node, and this might be due to your packages not being compatible with all the versions of Node. What NVM allows you to do is have multiple versions of Node running on your system, so you can easily switch between them based on the project. And it also helps you avoid polluting your system with a single version of Node, because like I said, you have these issues where you want to try out the latest version of Node without impacting any of the other applications that you have that are using that specific version. So, when we get Node 16, we want to see if our application runs, and it's almost easy as saying, NVM install Node, v16 as a client command in a different directory, and then using that version to test out your application. So that's great. But the issue with that is, even if you're using this, you need to communicate this to your developers. How do you tell them that this is a version of Node you're using? And this is something I've seen a lot. I pulled down a repository from, internally from our developers, but also from coding challenges as well. And the first thing I look to see is what version of Node did they use to build this code? And I'm more than likely getting back to them and asking just to double check. Yeah, okay, it's this version. It's not a big issue. I think more than likely that it will work, depending on if it's a recent version, it will work. There's less and less breaking changes, especially on a front-end development project rather than a back-end development project. But it's nice to include this information so that everyone's clear and there aren't any issues with conflicts or running a different version of Node. You're getting a different experience from someone else, and there might be an issue that would only exist in that version and not the other. And to provide that information, one way we would recommend is, if you're using NVM, there is a special file type or special file called .nvmrc that you can include in the root of your project. And .nvmrc is just a text file, and all you have to do is specify the version of your node. You can say just a major version, so you can just enter 14 in that file, save that file as 14, commit it to your code, and push that out. Or you can say, 14.4 or whatever, like really get granular on the exact versions. And NVM will recognize that and see what versions if that version of Node exists on your system. If it doesn't, it will suggest and install that for you. And as simple as clone the repo, and then you see the NVMRC file, and I'm writing NVM use on my command line, and it will automatically switch that version for me, and I'm ready to go with Node. There's also the option to do this on your package.json file as well. You have, similar to dependencies and dev dependencies, you have a key called engines. And engines, you can specify the minimums and the maximum versions of Node that your application supports. So you can say, look, this application is tested from 10 to 14, but we're not sure about 15. So you can say more than 10 and less than 15. Likewise, it's for NPM, because NPM has some of the major versions that are doing things differently. And depending on that, you might have different package log files. And that can usually sometimes cause conflicts if you're installing it. So you can specify both Node version and NPM version using the engines. I recommend, using NVM, having the NVMRC file, but also specifying that version package.json as well. One thing with package.json is it's only advisory. So if someone's doing NPM install, it will tell them as a warning that you're probably using an incompatible version of Node or NPM. So it doesn't stop a user from using it, but it will give them a warning. You can use an npm rc file and say engine strict equals true. And what that will do is it will throw an error. So if you want to be really strict about it, then that can also be done. Moving on from that, so in the context of staying on npm, this is maybe, I think there's a lot of understanding between dependencies and dev dependencies, but I still see it's not clearly used. So I just want to include this slide on here to say that the using dependencies, dev dependencies, I think we need to have a clear understanding of what they are, and like I said, most of you should know that dependencies, I see them as applications that you require when you are running your application. If your application directly uses this while it's running, so after it has been built, then that should go on your dependencies as installed as a dependency. And some of the examples here are Axios and VueJS, because when your application is running online, they are going to be used for either sending out requests or managing your internal state using a store. Dev dependencies are things like your testing tools, your linting tools. They won't get bundled up when you're doing your development. You won't see ESLint or Jest being published online. I think Webpack solves a lot of these problems already, regardless of where you install them. At the end of the day, on a front-end application, Webpack will make sure that it will only bundle the stuff you need. But I think it will be still good to have that clear separation, because if someone's looking at your package.json file and they are looking at dependencies, they know, okay, right, these are the ones that are critical to the application to function. These are the stuff that we're using, that a front-end user, or when it's deployed, that gets used. And then another point that I want to touch on the npm side is npm has a security advisory repository center that gives you warnings about different security vulnerabilities with packages. And you might see this when you're doing an npm install. You might be given a warning, low, and there's different levels that you can see. But what I would say is that if you see a high or a critical vulnerability pop up on your npm install, please address these. Most of the time, these could be related to your development tool, so it probably doesn't impact anything that's deployed online. But there might be the odd chance that one of the packages you're installing has an XSS vulnerability. And what I mean by XSS is cross-site it's injecting code to for an end user to be able to inject code into your application and cause havoc to anyone else that's using that. So it's safe to say that if you see a high or a critical security vulnerability, please address that and make sure that you are using, if there's a fix for it already, using the latest version of that package. Otherwise, you don't want to leave these issues running where someone's able to inject code into your application. And there's a command called Npm Audit that you can run frequently, and I would recommend running something like that frequently just to see and keeping up on top of package releases. And in general, I think if you're using packages for your application, to subscribe to some sort of feed on release cycles and change logs, and always monitor what they're releasing, because they might release something saying, oh, don't use this version, we found a vulnerability, please upgrade. So if you're not actively doing that, I recommend doing that. But ignoring high and critical could lead to a security risk in your application. So VueCli is great. I think it allows us to quickly prototype our application, and if you want to spin something up to either show a demo or a quick prototype, it's good. But once you start thinking about building an application for production use, we don't recommend just going and selecting the default options on there. And I've even for prototyping, I've just started manually selecting the features I want and making sure that I'm picking features that are up to date and recommended. So when you run VueCli create on your project, you will have the option to select just use default or manually select features. And I'll just run through some of the options that we would normally pick if we were to start a Vue application, or even if I was doing some sort of product prototype. This is the process I go through. So for one of our projects, we're using Vue 3, but some of these options are going to be similar if you're using Vue 2 as well. Your first option you would get is to choose what features you want. We pretty much use most of these features that are listed on here. And then once you pick your version of Vue you're using, then you get questions like, do you want to use class style components? If you're using Vue 3, the preferred way is using the composition functions. Class style components are, even though it can be used, but there are more examples for composition functions, so that if you're stuck on something, it's easy for you to look up that code. And there's better TypeScript support as well. For Babel alongside TypeScript, we still have to use it because we still support some browsers that needs to be polyfilled. But ideally, we get to a stage where we don't have to polyfill everything because everyone's going to be on the evergreen browsers that are later. And hopefully, in IE 11, that's been announced that it's not going to be a thing anymore. It's going to be a lot easier for us as developers going forward. But you might need this if you're using more up-to-date web APIs that are currently still, draft spec or proposal. Then you might still need to polyfill this stuff. History mode. I think everyone's using this now. There's no, I don't see a lot of hash-based routing on the websites anymore. It does require you to have your server set up so that it serves that properly. Your 404 fallback goes to the actual index HTML so that you don't have to have the hash in front. I think that's everyone's pretty much uses that. If you're using CSS processing, there are options to use Node Sass and Dart Sass, and I think the default installation still does Node Sass, but what I recommend is picking the Dart Sass option because Node Sass is actually deprecated, and they're recommending you use Dart Sass anyway. So that's a point that missed out. Maybe the client create tool has updated recently that allows you to do it, but I always use Dart Sass. Linting. So linting is, I think we're really big on linting, and we're using Prettier, but this is an opinionated thing. You might be using Airbnb, you might be using standard, and these are a couple of options that you get when you run this command. Only reason we're using Prettier is we like the rules that Prettier already provides off the shelf. It's opinionated. It's an opinionated linter. So if you don't agree with anything, then you can always customize this in your ESLint RC file. But the fact that there's not a lot of customizations mean that there's a lot less things to go wrong, because once you start customizing all these rules and your developer starts customizing all these rules, then you don't have a single process in place. So if you're not currently using any sort of linting or formatting, I would recommend going with Prettier. But if you already have a particular reason to go with Airbnb style guide or standard style guide, then that's an option for you to pick. But whatever you do, pick a linter and use it and stick by it. Likewise, if you're going to use a linter, lint those code in your file and make sure that you have it fixing before you commit. Because what I'm usually saying is people pushing code up, even though the linter's been used, they haven't linted that code. So when I'm doing a review and there's been a change, and then they do a change and they lint the code, and all of a sudden there's like 10 different files updated because the rest of the stuff has been linted, and it's really hard to review code like that. And that's why we recommend making sure that you have linting in space and lint. If you're doing any sort of testing, I recommend using Jest, but again, this is opinionated. You might have a different solution for you using unit testing. Jest is quite popular and has a lot more support if you're stuck, and has a simple API as well. End-to-end testing, Cypress, really nice API, and it you can quickly get started on doing your end-to-end testing on that. So the next option is all these configuration files. You have the option of including that in your package.json file, or you have the option of including that as dedicated config files. Now, I'm going to go more into this in one of my upcoming slides, but always go for dedicated config files, and I'll speak more about this on that slide. And once you go through all these options, you don't want to keep going through them. So VueClient gives you a nice little feature there to save that as a preset. So next time when you do VueClient create, you can just select that preset and you don't have to go through all these options again. So dedicated configuration files. The issue with having all that stuff in package.json is that it pollutes the package.json from what package.json should be. You shouldn't specify, I believe you shouldn't specify your linting configurations, your jest configurations, or anything that it doesn't belong in package.json which is why dedicated configuration files come in place, because it allows you to easily manage those configurations when they're in individual files. But the biggest reason that I see or have seen is that if you're using any sort of CI/CD pipeline that allows you to deploy out your application that gets built and tested, sometimes your build process, you will start caching the actual packages, and your CI/CD server might look at your package.json and it will decide if an npm install needs to run. Now, imagine that there are some sort of configuration changes at that time, and it's not a package, but you've changed the, some linting rule that you've brought in. That's going to invalidate that cache on your CI/CD server, which means that it's going to do an npm install when no packages were installed at all. And this could slow down your CI/CD process, but also if you are, if you're on GitLab, for example, and you have a certain amount of minutes that you can use per month, you're using that up when you can essentially just not have to worry about it. So always put these in individual files, and it also becomes easier when you're reviewing code as well. You don't want to see a package.json change and all of a sudden, oh no, someone's changed the package. This review is bigger than I thought, because I need to go and see, well, what version of package did they install? And then you realize, oh no, it was actually just a linting change. So it's generally better to do that. Okay, so the next thing I'm looking at is hard coding different values within your application that are essentially environment specific. What this means is that you might have a backend that your application points at, and while testing, this could be localhost 5000, depending on whatever, I'm using 5000 as a port example, but your backend might be running on some endpoint and some port. What I usually say is that this value is hard-coded. So if I'm using Axios as an example, your base path for your Axios might be this, and that might be committed in code. Now, what happens is that if a developer pulls down that code and their backend, for some reason, is hosted on a different port, they have to now go and change that bit in the code, and then they have to make sure that when they're committing it, that they are not committing that back. And then if they do commit it back, then there's a conflict because someone else has a different port. So Vue actually has a nice built-in way of managing this, and it's called modes and environments. And there's a link there on the guide that tells you more about what that does. And there's 3 modes, but you can have multiple modes: development, test, and production. And depending on how that's deployed, your correct environmental file will get picked up. And .env is the sort of the base configuration you can have. But then when you have .env.production, then that will use it if you have your environment sent to production. And likewise, in these files, there is the .local option. And .env.local option, if you have a file named .env.local, that doesn't get committed to code. So the problem I was outlining before, if you set it in there, then you don't have to worry about pushing that file to someone else, because it is ignored automatically if you go through the VueClient process. And what you can do is in these files is include your actual variable that will hold that value. As long as it's prefixed with Vue_app_ and then whatever you want to call it, those will be bundled into your application that you can reference directly and use as a variable rather than the value. So things like, if you have public API keys for things that are supposed to be public, backend endpoints, I would recommend using this. So this is a prime example of what I was talking about before. Your Axios might have the base URL set, and that's where I consider a hard-coded code. Because if I have my backend base URL running on port 6000, then I'm going to have to go change that in code. Not ideal. What you do is you have your nvlocal file, you set your key to Vue app. I'm using API endpoint as the key name in this example, and you set it. And then on your Axios, you would go and just change that to process any Vue app API endpoint. What Webpack does is they actually replace that value with a value in your local file, so you don't have to worry about it. And your developers can connect to a local endpoint like localhost. You might have a staging endpoint or a production endpoint. Cool. Layout and structure. I think this is one of the key things that we need to get right from the very start. This is the foundations of your application, and you need to make sure that there is a clear separation between what a component is and what a view and page is. The way I see components they are building blocks that can be used to produce a view or a page. I've seen examples of people using components to have separation between the component, but also using component to display pages. If you're doing something quick, okay, it makes sense, but getting into the habit of separating this out and knowing that clear separation is important. And likewise, if you're using certain functions that are used across components or pages, make sure you have a utility folder and hold those functions as utility functions. And that will allow you to reuse these without having to go into a component and take stuff from components. So have a look at functions that are used across your components and see if you can pull these out to their sort of independent files that can be stored somewhere else. One other thing is, if you're using a library like Axios, I'm going back to this Axios example because I think everyone sort of knows what it is and has an idea of what it is. You should consider if you want to use this library directly within your components or your views, because if you at some point want to change from Axios to Fetch, you now have to go through these components that have directly imported the Axios module and change the reference, and that can be a tedious task, especially if there are slight API changes. What I would recommend is for things that are used across and things that could potentially change in the future, if you're thinking about migrating or changing that, use a plugin or a service. So create a plugin called HTTP, Axios, whatever it is, import your Axios in there and build your API out or build your scaffold out in that file, and then use that service within your component. What happens then is if you now bring in Fetch, or if Fetch becomes more available in browsers, you can then go back to this HTTP file and say, okay, I'm going to now replace Axios and I'm going to use Fetch, and you change that one file, and as long as the APIs match, all your components will be able to use that library without having considerable changes. So that's what I recommend on the layout and structure. These are three things that I've noticed. With that, hopefully you can see this. I've tried to sort of outline what, some of this stuff is already set up by WooClient already. But just to sort of summarize what I've said in some of the previous slides, you already know, your this folder holds all your bundled code, your public assets and stuff are in there. This is what I meant by components. So your components are the building blocks. You might have header, model as a component. Routing, you're already most likely using routing for something. Services, what I meant about having your reusable functions as reusable modules imported so you can use them directly somewhere else. Store, if you're using VueJS. If you're using TypeScript, you might have a types folder. Utility functions this is what I mean by breaking up shared functionality into a utility folder. Your views are now, say, home will have the model and the header, or header component using that Vue, and app.main is your container, and main.tsg entry file. I think this is quite standard, but just utils and stuff covered there. And then when you go back to using those dedicated files, you will have a lot of these files on here, but that's fine. This is how we're doing it, and it's better than having everything in package.json. You can read more about these files that we're including. So this is an example project that we've used internally, and different configurations for linting, what the linting should ignore, different supported browsers that we're targeting, NVM RC file I mentioned earlier on in the slide, specifying the version of Node you're using, Babel jest config, prettier config, and finally your Vue config that comes in as standard. So with that, I think that's me, and hopefully that was a sort of a quick it's not all the best practices, but I've just tried to outline the issues that I've seen, and that tells me that maybe a lot of other people are making the same mistakes as well. And hopefully that was good. And yeah, thank you for having me today. And if there's any more questions, then I'm happy to answer.
Okay, awesome. That was actually really amazing. I definitely learned a lot. Thank you, Cham, so much for sharing your insight with us. I have a ton of questions to ask you, and hopefully we
Okay.
can learn for the questions. And also, if you have questions for Cham, please make sure to drop them in the YouTube chat, and we'll get to you. So, firstly, I would love to know what is the biggest challenge that you have experienced leading a team of Vue.js developers when we're talking about maybe the component architecture, maybe components growing too big or too small, or routing? What basically has been the biggest challenge that you've experienced?
I think you've just outlined the challenge in your question there. The bigger challenge is getting them to decide how big a component should be and how small a component should be. There's no right or wrong answer. I think the challenge before all this linting was put in place was for them to produce code and them to write code that was following the same formats, following the same linting rules. And that's always been an issue over the years. And I'm so glad that we have processes that allows us to say, okay, if you're developing this component and you're going to push that, then the code in there is going to look, the spacing is going to be right. The if statements are going to have the bracket in the right places. There's going to be your variables are you're using const and you're using stuff like that. These are stuff that I have issues when I'm reviewing code, because you're actually distracting yourself from what you need to be reviewing and what you should be reviewing. And I think that's the biggest pain point when you have a bigger Vue.js development team. If you're mainly part of the reviewing team, you want to completely not deal with that because you're wasting your time doing it. And that's why that these rules have helped us to eliminate all that stuff. And and the issue with big components and small components, there's no right or wrong answer. I think what I end up doing is when we have a feature that come in, we would usually have a meeting with our developers and we ask them to go through and tell them how you would implement this. And then there might be a follow-up meeting, say, okay, where do you see that functionality breaking down? Okay, so, this is a model component. Right. What other things are going to be in this model component? Is there going to be, accordions? Is there going to be drop downs? Okay, can this model component be reused for something else? In that case, when you reuse that model, do you have to have an accordion or do you have to have anything in there? In that case, should accordion not be its own component and use that as well? Because if the way you're using that accordion changes, then you don't want to go and change that in all the model components that you have. So it is an active process. There's no right or wrong answer, but we have this process where we go through and identify what is reusable and what is not reusable, and that's how we decide how big a component can be, and then how that's used within a view or a page.
Oh, awesome! Thank you for sharing. Another question popping up here. I think Onyinye wants to find out if you have any recommendations for when to use state management, since you've built a ton of projects in your teams. Is there any projects where you would use state management or not, and which state management would you recommend for building the best Vue applications?
Yeah, so for us, state management is critical because our dashboard for managing reviews is, for the customer, there's a lot of things that we're doing feature-wise, importing, and we're bringing in all these features, and we want to have a central store, because the idea of having a product and the product can be linked to so many different things, reviews, image upload, imports, and stuff like that. We need to have that central store. So usually people say that don't worry about state management unless you have a state problem, but the answer to that is, if you're building a production application and this is going to end up seeing customers or it is going to be fairly used at some point, then I would personally recommend using state management from the very start. I think there's so much content out there that and a lot of good content out there on how to bring that in. It is a bit of a uphill battle trying to get it in, but once you've actually got your state management in, you could fly with it. Once you set the base down, then it's easy. It does increase that development time a bit, but you'll thank yourself in 6 months down the line when one of your components needs access to a certain state from a different component, and to be able to use that, it will make it easy. I think you're paying the price now so that it will be cheaper later on in time. In terms of what I recommend for Vue 2, the Vuex is perfectly fine. You can use that state management. For Vue 3, it's not clear because they have things like their reactive model and their ref. There isn't anything. We recently started working on a Vue 3 project, and it wasn't quite clear on what. I think people are still trying to figure out what works best. There's building your own state management, and then there's also different projects out there called. I think one of the ones I've came across is Pina, Pina. Have a look into that if you're using Vue 3. It's great. It takes its ideas from Vuex, but it has a Vue 3 spin on it. So it's using the composition API. To do that, but composition API on its own does allow you to have sort of your own store, and there's some articles out there that lets you do that. So if you're using Vue 3, look into Pina. There's currently, I believe, an RFC where people are discussing how state management should be done in Vue, but it's still something we're in the exploration stage on doing. But the two things I mentioned, composition API based state management, or Pina, Pina, I think. Just double checking. Pina. That's by an account called POSVA, POSVA on GitHub. If you have a look at that, it's really good. And we were thinking of using this before we actually rolled out our own state for Vue 3.
Okay, sounds good. Definitely, you're exposing questions that people would definitely run into if they do not pay attention. So thank you so much for expanding on that. One final question from Rajesh. So he wants to find out how would you choose between using Nuxt.js and VueJS? What's the best practice there when you are choosing whether you're using Nuxt or create a Vue app for a new project?
Okay, so Nuxt is great, and this is a personal view on why we chose Nuxt for our marketing website. Our marketing website was using Angular before, and we wanted to sort of speed that up with Lighthouse cores. And Vue is great, right? But when we evaluated whether we needed all that functionality, and evaluated that along with Nuxt, we saw Nuxt was a better fit because in the end of the day, you get your static stuff built, and you can easily publish that. But what we saw was that the speed that we got through using Nuxt was a lot better for our Lighthouse scores, and it was a lot lightweight as well. So it depends how much feature-rich your application might be. If you're building a really complex dashboard, I would always recommend going with Vue just because of the support that's out there, but also the extended functionality you get. But if you're building a website that is a marketing website or some sort of blog, something really static-based, almost like, I would look at Nuxt as a replacement for your, static pages that you used to build back in the day with your HTML and CSS file. Go for Nuxt. If you don't have a lot of functionality, it's great, it's fast. But if you're building a lot of interactive within your application, go for a Vue.js. So that's how I see the separation.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much for sharing your tips. I personally learned a ton of things from you. So thank you so much for exposing your knowledge. Definitely very helpful for our developers in the Vue community. So we've taken a ton of time, and I think I personally enjoyed talking to Cham a lot. So thank you so much, Cham, for sharing your knowledge. So at this point, we're just going to jump straight to Omotoye, who is going to talk to us about Vue.js and TypeScript. And I think this is definitely one of the best practices that you can, use to build more sustainable Vue.js applications. So Omotoye is going to be sharing his knowledge, telling us how we can use TypeScript to, improve the quality and maintenance of our Vue.js application. Omotoye is going to introduce himself right now and then go straight into his talk. Thank you so much, Omotoye, for coming. Take it on.
Thank you very much.
I'll
Okay.
have to interject. Cham, please can you make Omotoye the host? I think on the more settings. When you click on Omotoye, yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Zoom, for the great heroes I experienced.
Sorry, can you say that again?
I will say, can you make Omotoye the host?
Okay, all right. Let me see if I have the option. Oh, yeah, sorry. You want to change host to yes, that should be it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cham. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay. Okay. I hope the Zoom is not obstructing the text. This is Vue with TypeScript. My name is Iwaki Omotoye. What is the aim? What is the objective? What do we look forward to getting before the end or by the end of this talk? We'll be able to get three things. First, you will have increased desire on wanting to use TypeScript in your Vue application. You have the basic understanding of how to use Vue in general, and you also have the basic understanding of how to use Vue in TypeScript. Why use TypeScript Info 3? Vue 2 was built with JavaScript. Vue 3 was written in TypeScript. And so when you use TypeScript Info 3, you do not need to use any tooling, any extra tool to make TypeScript work well in Vue 3. But in Vue 2, you have to do some little acts here and there to make TypeScript work perfectly in Vue 2. But with Vue 3, it is built in. So all you just need to do is import the functions that you need inside your components, and you have your TypeScript running in your Vue application. And also, if you use TypeScript in your application, whether Vue or React or whatever it is, it would prevent potential runtime error, which can be in form of bugs. It helps you to detect bugs fast, even before they get to the runtime. So TypeScript helps reduce potential runtime error, especially when your app is getting larger and there is more possibility of you having bugs in your application. Now, but whenever you talk to people about using TypeScript in their Vue apps, you see many people telling you that they are satisfied with using JavaScript and all. But when you look at it deep, some individuals have reasons why they hold back from using TypeScript in their Vue application or in whatever application they are building. Some feel that they might get trapped while using TypeScript. Some feel that when they start using TypeScript and they get some TypeScript error at some points, they might find it hard to be able to solve those errors. Maybe you have a variable that is of type string, and then you want to change the value to something else, and you don't know how you can go about it. So many people just choose to avoid TypeScript entirely. While some, because they've built their app to some considerable extent, they will think that using TypeScript will mean that they will have to rebuild their app from the beginning. But that is not the case. So if an individual wants to use TypeScript with a Vue application, you might leave the ones that you've built already and say, okay, going forward, every new component I'm creating, I can start to implement TypeScript little by little. And then when there's time, you can go back to your old components that you created in JavaScript and then implement your TypeScript. Even if you have created the Vue app without using TypeScript, Vue creates a way that you can add TypeScript into your Vue app. We are going to see that as we continue. What are the tools that an individual can use to make TypeScript enjoyable, an enjoyable experience as you build your Vue application? One very popular IDE that is development environment is the Visual Studio Code. And so almost all of us know the Visual Studio Code. And the Visual Studio Code is preferable because it supports TypeScript out of the box. So you don't necessarily need so much extensions to make the development environment support TypeScript. And there's also another extension called Vitor. I don't know if I pronounced the name correctly, but it's called Vitor. That extension, it also supports Vue and TypeScript, especially if you're using your single file component. When I say single file component, I mean the kind of component that you build where you have your templates, your scripts, and your style all in one file. Yes. So if you are using that, you can add the Vitor extension inside your Visual Studio Code. It's going to make it easy for you to be able to use TypeScript with Vue. I personally use Visual Studio Code, and I also use Vitor extension. But if you don't want to use Visual Studio Code, you still have another option. You can use WebStorm that also supports TypeScript and Vue out of the box. Now, if you want to use TypeScript with your Vue, just like you would do if you are creating even your normal Vue app, the first thing you need to do is you install your Vue CLI. So let me give an example. Sorry. Okay, let me just stop this screen share so that I can go to my terminal. Okay. So this is my CMD terminal, and I can do npm install. You can add the global that it will be installed globally, Vue CLI. So when you do this, it will be possible for you to install the Vue CLI globally on your system. And after you've done that, you can now say Vue create. Let's assume that we want to create a sample application, say Vue 3 and TypeScript. The same way you create an application in Vue 2. The only difference now is the options that we are going to select when we want to create this app. Okay, so I have some pre-selected ones, but I'm going to go to manually select so that I can show you the features that you choose. You choose Babel, you choose TypeScript. It's up to you, but usually I choose Router and VueJS, CSS, and Linter, that's all. But the main thing here is this TypeScript. So once you select TypeScript and you click enter, you select Vue 3, style components, no. Okay, use Babel alongside TypeScript. Okay, sorry, click on enter so you just run through. Okay, so Babel alongside TypeScript, yes, and all. So the main point from this example that I just showed is make sure you select TypeScript when you are creating your application. Also make sure that you choose version 3 so that you have easy support for TypeScript. So since I already have an app that I've created with Vue 3 and TypeScript, I'm not going to create it again, but you can choose to do that if you want to follow along as we do this. Okay. So what if you already, what if you already have created an app and that app does not support TypeScript? What can you do? I'm still going to share my screen. Okay, so if you have created an app already and that app does not support TypeScript, you can go to the directory of the app and say Vue add TypeScript. This command, Vue add TypeScript, will add TypeScript into your Vue app. So you either select TypeScript while you are creating your app, or you add it if the app has already been created before you decide to want to add TypeScript into it. Okay, so after doing this, what is next? Please pardon me for having to share my screen and stop multiple times. So after this, what is next? The first thing you will do is when you create your components, you are going to add an attribute called lang, that is language, and set the value to TS. You are also going to define components. You are going to use the define components global method, and I'm going to illustrate in my VS code. So let me go to my VS code. Yes, my VS code. Now, this is my comment. So this is my VS code. This is an app. The app is called Vue 3 and TypeScript. And I'm just going to show an example of how you can do components with TypeScript. Now, let's create a new file. I'm going to name it new.vue, just for illustration purposes. And we have templates. We have our scripts. Usually in Vue 2, when we want to create our script, all we just do is we say export default. That's all. And say the name of the component, say new, and data, something like this. Something like this. But now, if you want to use TypeScript, and sorry, I skipped something. First thing that you will notice if your app is built with TypeScript is first, you check your main. You'll see this, that your main is no longer main.js, but now it is main.ts. That means your Vue app is in TypeScript. You also see these streams -vue.p.ts. When you see that, you know that your Vue application is in TypeScript. Okay, now I was trying to illustrate how you can make your components use TypeScript. Now, first, in your script, you create a lang attribute, lang, and set the value to TS. And you import define components from Vue. So, since you import these define components, you are going to wrap this method, this global method, around your options API. When I say options API, I mean your data, your computed, your methods, all the options API. So you wrap your define components around it. And just to show you that this is supporting TypeScript. Say, for example, I give it a name called TypeScript, and I create a method. Let me just create a method, and let me just say create or update. Now, say something. I want to try to change this name to a number. you'll see that I don't know if you can observe this red line under this.name. So TypeScript is supported and now it's throwing an error saying that it is a string and now you want to change it to number. Now, this will make us to talk about types in TypeScript. When we talk about types, what do we mean? Coming. When we talk about types, I'm going to illustrate. We have types, basic types in TypeScript like string, number, boolean, array. These are basic. For example, I'm sure based on your knowledge of Vue and JavaScript, you know that this is a string. And so TypeScript already has inferred the type of this data name based on the value that was given to it. If I give it a value of number, say 1, 2, 3, it has known that. Now, when I mouse over this name, we can see that name adds the type of number. So whenever I want to update name and I give it number, TypeScript is not going to shout. It has known that this is a type of number. But if I change it to string, it's going to shout, except I change the value to string. Something like this. So we also have another one, boolean. When I give it true, TypeScript knows that this name has a type of boolean, and any value that will be updating that name must be a boolean. Then another one is array. Let me illustrate it inside this method. Now look at this method update. I will say let's list items now equals to, let me use some fruits as an example, orange, apple, and apple. Now, if you look at this, we'll see that it's a string array. So how can we signify that this is a string array? We can just put the column and say it is of type string and add the array in front of it. Let us also note that even though it's not compulsory, but it is like a norm, even when you check Vue documentation, that when they state types, especially when they are primitive types, or types generally, they use lowercase s. So now this list item, we can see that is a string array. So if I try to change list item to another type of array, maybe numbers array, you are going to see that TypeScript is going to underline it, that something is wrong with it. Another type that is worth knowing is any. When you use the any type, you are telling TypeScript that let it not check type. For example, look at this array now. Like, okay, initially I said list item equals to, I set it to a number array. Let me say 2, 5, 8. And TypeScript is underlining the values because it does not agree with the type that I have defined initially. Now, if I change the string to any, if I change the type to any, we'll see that TypeScript no longer checks the type anymore. So I can change it from a string to a number, but it's usually discouraged to use any in your Vue application, even though sometimes it might not be easy to totally escape it when building your application. But as much as you can, do your best to avoid using any, because if you use any many times, then the question is, why are you using TypeScript? Because the main reason why you're using TypeScript is because you want TypeScript to check the types of the variables, objects that you create in your application. And so if you're using any, then that purpose has been defeated. Okay. So now that we understand types, and there are some, let me share my screen, sorry. Okay. There are some, so earlier I explained something. I said, if an individual creates a variable that uses one of the primitive types or the basic types, say for example, name, and I didn't give it a type, but I just say, say for example, if I want to update this name, I cannot give it any other type because TypeScript already knows that this name is a type of string. So any value I update must be a type of string. But there are some times that TypeScript cannot know, especially when it is complex, when the values are complex. Say, for example, the value is the value of object. Say, let me give an example, constant user, and it's an object. We have a name. Let me say, John. And we have age. Let me say 20. Now, TypeScript cannot automatically know the type of this user. And so it cannot infer or assign a type to it. Okay, now let me change this one to let, because if you are using const, it's not possible to be able to update the value. Now, okay. So now, if on circumstances like this, what do you do to make TypeScript to be able to know the type of object that this is? That is where we introduce interfaces. I'm going to create a new file in my SRC, and let me call it user interface. User interface.ts. And I can just, to create an interface in TypeScript, you can say interface user equals to name, then you define the types of the properties, name, string, age, number. But many times, so that it is easy for other developers to understand what you are doing, many developers choose to add interface in front of this user so that you know that this user is an interface. So in normal JavaScript, if you want to, normal JavaScript, if say for example, you have a constant, I'm just going to draw an example here. Say you have a constant user, you can just say it is of type user interface, and then create the name, say Mark, and create the age, say 20. Okay, sorry. Equals to here. So you see that there is no error here. But now let me choose to change this John Mark to a number. It's underlining me that something is wrong. Why? Because you used this interface to tell TypeScript that this is the shape or this is the type of user. And so when you give it any property, it must follow the type that you've defined initially. But now, how do you do it in Vue? It is, we use something that we call type assertions. But before I go into that, I would like to explain how type assertion is being done in TypeScript. Let me create an example. Say, for example, I have let amount, and this amount has a value of 100. If maybe for circumstances, or I want to carry out something, and I want to change this amount value to, this amount value is coming in as a string. TypeScript is going to shout, and so we do what we call type assertion in TypeScript. Say 200 as unknown as number. I'm going to explain. Now, this is what we call type assertion in TypeScript. That is, it has a particular type. We are telling TypeScript that even though this is a string, change the type to a number. Ordinarily, I could have said that amount equals to 200 as number, but because TypeScript is going to throw an error, because in TypeScript, there are some types that are not allowed to be asserted directly to other types. Like, for example, strings and number, because they are closely related. You can easily, if I want, I can easily change a number string to a number type to a string type. And so many times we use another type called unknown. So if TypeScript does not allow you to assert or to change a value from one type to another, you can first change it to an unknown type, and then you bring it back to number. So this is type assertion in TypeScript. Let me give another example for clarity's sake. Let's assume that I say completed, and I say this completed is false. And maybe the value I'm getting now is 0 or 1 to determine whether something is completed or not. Like there might be instances, maybe you are getting data from a place and you want to state, you want to make sure that it still obeys this Boolean type that this completed has. Because look at me over and over it, you can see completed is a Boolean. Now, and the value that is coming in is 1 or 0. Let's say 1. TypeScript is going to throw an error that type number is not assignable to type Boolean. So here we can also use type assertion as Boolean. And now say that overlap on another. So we can just say as unknown as Boolean. And now it's not going to shout. So we see this is what we call type assertion, telling it that this value, make it a Boolean, so that it is easy for it to assign that value to that variable completed that is of type Boolean. Now, having an understanding of what type assertions are, we are going to apply it in this example. We have created interface, user interface. Now let me come to my new component I created. I'm going to remove all of this and say we have user that is going to be coming in. We are going to be getting that user from an API. So initially we cannot give it any value. It's going to be an empty object because the values are apparently going to be coming from an API. But you also want it to follow a particular shape. So the first thing I will do is I will first import the interface that I've created. Okay, I can export my interface. So I have to first export it. export interface, user interface. Then I'll come to my new, I'll say import user interface from user interface. And now type assertion. To make the Vue understand that this object must have a shape of this interface. I'll say as user interface. As user interface. Okay, sorry. Uppercase U. So you can see now, it shows no error. Now, if I want to update this user and I say this.user, and I want to add it, okay, let me first obey the shape. I say name. Now I'm going to use the example I used earlier. The name is a string. Let me say Sarah George. And I say age 44. You can see that TypeScript is not making noise because this user perfectly follows the shape of the user interface assigned to it. But what if I try to change it and say age 44? You see, it's going to underline the age, telling us that the type string is not assignable to type number because from the user interface here, age is of type number. So we'll take it back to number. So this is how to use interfaces in your Vue app. You have to first understand interface. When you understand interface, it will be easy for you to create an interface. And all you just have to do is use the keyword interface, give your interface a name, and then specify the properties of that interface. And then come to your components, import the interface, and then give it an empty object, or even if it is an array. Let me change this. Say, for example, this is an array of values, and just say user interface array. So all I just have to do is put it inside an array. So you can see. So even if it is an array of these objects, all you just have to do is say as user interface array, and then anytime the value comes, you see, it's not going to throw an error. So we've understood user interface, we've understood type assertions. We've understood type assertions. The next that we would like to talk about is function return types. Let me share my screen again, sorry. So many times when we build a function or when we write a function, we might want to state the return type of that function. I'm going to use a very popular example to illustrate this. Say we have first name, I'm going to call it Sarah, and we have last name in our component. I'm going to call it George. And we want to create a function called getFullName. Now, and it's going to return something. And many times we usually use this in computed because computed always return a value. I'm going to use it in computed and not methods. completed, and I say get full name, and I say return this dot first name plus this dot last name. Now, okay, I'm getting an error. Now, say for example, we say this is going to return a type of string. Yeah. You can see that because the return value of this get full name is string, it is not throwing an error. But what if I was returning a number? It's going to throw an error. And if you over it, it says number is not assignable to type string. For me to be able to make it satisfy this error, that means it must return a type number. So that's one thing about return values in function. When we after the closing parenthesis of that function, you state the type, a semicolon, and then you state the type of value that that function will return. If it is returning a number, you state if it is returning a string. If it is returning an array of number, you also state it there. So let me just revert this to the old example. So this is how we use return functions in when we are doing our full apps. Okay, I think it is clear, so I can continue. The next thing we would talk about is using generics. Because when you build your Vue app, circumstances would make you use generics. So let's talk about generics a little bit. And I'm still going to share my screen again. Okay, so let me try to go to user interface so that I can explain what I want to do here. Now, say for example, I have a function creates number lists. And this function accepts a value that of type number. Also, our parameters in function, we can also give it a type, telling TypeScript what type will be returned, what type the parameter will be, sorry. And we say that this is going to return a number array. And then I say constant item lists equals to an array, which is of type number array. And then I say that item lists dot push value return item lists. Now look at this small example. This is a create number list that accepts a parameter, and we add a type of number to it. It's going to return a number array. Inside the function, we create item lists, which is an array of numbers. We push the value, which is a number, into this array, and then we return it. Very simple. Now, what will happen if I want to do this same function, but I want to use a string? It will mean that I will have to rewrite it. It will mean that I will have to rewrite this function. So please permit me to copy it. Then I will say something like create string lists. And then I will change this. I'll change this, and this to string. You see? Now I have to create two functions. Why? I should not do that. I should be able to get a way to create one function that will satisfy the two scenarios. And that is where generics comes in. Let me show the third function that uses generics. I can say create new lists. And then I'm going to look at what I'll do here. Now, I can say type. Then I say value that has type. And it will return type array. And then let me copy this same thing there. But this time, this is of type. Okay, sorry, I'm making a mistake here. So you see this less than and greater than. You state the type and use this less than and greater than before the parenthesis. That means what you are telling it is that this function is going to use a custom type. Generally, many people, if you see some code base, you will see many people use just C instead of type. You can use whatever you like, whatever is you are more comfortable with. But many people use C just to show that it's a type, but that type is not defined. And so anytime you want to call that function, is create new list. All you just know that you do is you say create new list of type number and 1, 2, 3. You can see that it's not going to throw an error because what you are telling him is that see this number, this type you specified here. Now it is a type of number. If you change this to a string, it's going to error out. So let me say Sarah. Now you can see the error because I have specified that I am calling this function and I want to use a type number. So that's what generics is. Like you generalize the type. You tell it that this can use any type based on the type that was defined when the function was called. Now, why are we talking about generics? It's because whenever we want to use props in Vue apps, we use generics. Now I'm going to create a new file in this component. I'm going to call it child new.Vue. The reason why I'm calling it child new is because it's going to be a child of this component new. Now let me say new. It's going to add a child new. And then I have to import this child new from child new. And then I'm going to create child new.Vue. And then I'm going to create a component. And I'm going to say child new. Now, I want to illustrate types using custom types in props. Now, I've created a child new inside this new component. And now I want to pass it this user. Okay, initially we created a user. So I'm going to go back to that user as user interface. I'm going to take out this completed. Now I want to pass in this user as a props to this child. That is, okay, I want to make it an array of user. So it's an array of user interface. Now I want to pass in each user. Maybe you want to get a list of items and each item has its own, you want each item to have its own components. And that's when we can have a case scenario like this. And I say user. You can see it. Now I've passed in user props with the value of user, that is each user in that array. Okay, since we are going to make it a for loop so that it can loop through that array. So let me just add the for loop before. Okay, let me change this to users. So that this will be V for user in user and V bind. I'm going to do something. Since our user does not have ID, initially I'm just supposed to say user.id for my key. But since it does not have ID, and I don't want to go and create ID inside our interface, I can just say vbind. Okay, sorry. Shortcut for vbind is this for key equals to index. Now I've been able to create a for loop of this component child new. Let the length be equals to the length of users, and each component takes in a prop of user. Now, the most important thing is the prop, because it's going to get a custom type of user. Okay, script, language TS, import default components. Import default components. I'm going to be done very soon because of our time. Default components. Okay. Okay, sorry. Sorry, I'm doing something wrong. Sorry, define components. Define components. Okay. So now, let's say, let me just do a child name. Now it's going to accept a prop. Now, Vue initially made it possible. I can do something like this. I can say user. And then let me just create a paragraph and say user dot name. Now, initially, Vue, I can do this. But initially, Vue makes it possible for us to be able to type our props with something like this. User equals to type. You state the type, and then if it is required, you can state true or false, and you can even validate here. But now, because this my user is of type objects, this my user is of type objects. So what do I do? And I want to tell TypeScript that this user is a type of user interface. First thing I'm going to do is I will import user interface from user interface. And now, there's something else now that we have to import to make our user to work, to make the type work. We are going to import something that we call prop type. Prop type. So now this prop type, when we import it, we are going to say that this is an object of prop type user interface. Sorry. So we are going to say that this is an object as prop type user interface. Okay, capital U. I keep mixing it up. Okay, so you see now I told TypeScript that my user is going to be a type of object. And I did something that we discussed earlier that we called type assertion as. And I imported prop type. And then inside the prop type, there's something that we use when we're talking about generics to tell which type it is. So user interface. And so if I come to my methods, net, or let me use computed. Computed. And I want to manipulate that user. And I say get user name. I could do something like return user dot name of type string. Sorry, this is the user dot name. Okay. Getting an error. The object is undefined. Okay. I was trying to explain that this object has a type of user interface. And so when you start working with this user, TypeScript already knows that this user interface, it has this property name and it has the property age. But if you try to assign a different value to it, it's going to throw an error. But I don't know why this is showing an error. Saying cannot find user. User. Okay, I would not allow this to slow down the limited time. I can still create an application, put it on GitHub so that I can illustrate this better. So, but the point I was trying to explain is prop, we have for us to assign a type, a custom type to a prop. We need to tell TypeScript is an object, then assert the type by using the keyword as, then we have to import prop type and then say the type of user interface that it is. And so when we do that, we have been able to tell TypeScript as it inspects our Vue app that this is the shape that this user has. And so while we are working and we mistakenly import another shape, say we say user.color, and in our interface, we don't have color, we have only name and age, it's going to throw an error saying that it does not have that type. And so with this little explanation of talking about interfaces, talking about type assertions, talking about custom types in data and in props, we've been able to see way in which we can use TypeScript to improve our application. So I don't know, this is how much I can take. I don't know if you have a question. Okay, then if you decide to use TypeScript with your Vue and along the line you run into an error, you can always reach me on my Twitter handle, Joaquin Toye. So I don't know if you have a question, you are welcome to ask a question.
Yes, Omotoye, thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. Definitely some really amazing tips that you shared there. I have been using TypeScript also, and it's really amazing. You were definitely very right to choose this topic to share with us. Really giving us some insight on how we can improve our code bases, the advantages of TypeScript and things like that. Thank you so much for taking the time. So I got one or two questions for some people that were really interested. And first thing is, I think people really want to get some clarification on what are the advantages of including TypeScript into an existing code base. Like what are the advantages that it would bring? I think you mentioned one or two before. And also, what are the disadvantages? What are the things that they are going to experience as problems at the beginning that they should be aware of?
Okay, I will start with the disadvantages. One thing is, just like JavaScript, you get better at using it. TypeScript as well, you get better at using it. When you start using it, you might initially face some errors that might need you to have to do a little more research to understand how TypeScript works, so that it will be easy for you to solve those problems. Say, for example, type assertions. If you come across a situation where you just want to change, you want to tell TypeScript that it should assume the value to be a particular type, and you don't know how to do it, you may face an error. Or another example that time did not make me illustrate is when you are using TypeScript with your DOM. And TypeScript really does not know much about your DOM. And maybe say, for example, you do something like documents.getQuery, and then you get your input. And you want to do something like input.value. TypeScript does not know that. You have to tell TypeScript that this is a HTML input element, so that TypeScript can know that an input usually have a property of value. Mm-hmm. So the disadvantage is that if you don't know TypeScript, well, sometimes it might be a little bit of challenge to be able to use it. But I don't think that should really be a challenge, because many times you can always choose whether in a particular scenario you want to use TypeScript or not. And gradually, as time goes on, you become better at it, just as JavaScript. None of us became better at it in a day. We became better at it by use. And so if we never use TypeScript, we'll never become better at it. So even though it might slow us down a bit, but eventually it will get easy. Now, let me talk about the advantage. Now, imagine 10 software developers working on something. There's also something else that I couldn't talk about because of the time. Now, imagine 10 software developers working on something, and the value of something can either be, okay, yesterday, me and someone was working on a project, and the value can either be new, approved, or disapproved. Now, only me and the developer knows that the value of this thing can either be new, approved, or disapproved. Nobody else knows. Now, he from his back end sets the value. Maybe it says the value is approved or something. But if I'm using TypeScript, it is very easy. If another developer comes in, he does not know this information. He can just come and give that property a value that he feels is right. He may say, okay, let's use true or false, something like that. But if you are using TypeScript, it is easy for you to say, to do something that they call define types. You can just say type, let's say action. Then you can say new, approved, or disapproved. So any developer that is coming there does not need to waste time asking questions about what is the possible value of these things. They know once they try to set a value that is outside what you've set, they are going to get an error. So eventually, TypeScript helps to give future developers an idea on what you've been doing. Even you yourself, you can forget what you've agreed on, and then you come someday and you give it a value. You are going to face eventual bugs. But because you know that this is the value that is supposed to be, eventually it saves you that stress in future when you have to come back to work on the project.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that insight. Definitely really true what you're saying. That's why we see tons and tons of teams adapting TypeScript. That's why we see many projects migrating to TypeScript, and now most projects coming up today are in TypeScript. And I think I've also consulted with a number of companies, and they are all going full TypeScript in all of their repositories. So definitely some great advantages there that you shared with us. Thank you so much for taking the time. So at this point, I just want to say a huge thank you to our speakers that spent a lot of time compiling all of this information to share with us. Please, if you have any additional questions, do not hesitate to reach out to them on Twitter or reach out to us at VueJS NG and ask your questions, and we would relay to them. They are very willing to keep sharing their knowledge with you, as they mentioned. So I just want to say a quick shout out to our speakers, Cham and Omotoye, that spent tons of time sharing really amazing information with us today. We are super, super grateful that they took out the time to prepare the talk, prepare the answers, and come and share their knowledge with us all for free. Thank you so much for taking the time. And yeah, that's a wrap for our Vue.js meetup this May. And really, really grateful for our speakers that spend the time with us. So definitely tons and tons of other people are going to be watching this on YouTube, and you can reach out to us on Twitter if you have any other questions also. So Linda, I don't know if there's any other thing left. Is there?
Nope, we're good on this side.
Okay, awesome. Thank you guys so much. Thank you so much. And we'll catch you next month in June.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, Omotoye. Goodbye, Cham.
Goodbye. Thank you.